These days, there's a non-stop deluge of propaganda in the Western media claiming that China and Russia are threatening the world. We're constantly told that Russia is a military threat to peace on planet Earth. And yet, new data shows that the United States is responsible for roughly 40% of all military expenditure on planet Earth. And NATO is responsible for over half of military expenditure on Earth. We're talking about more than $1.2 trillion spent on the military just in 2022. In fact, the United States spent 10 times as much on its military in 2022 than Russia did. The US spent $877 billion on its military. Russia spent $86 billion, 1/10 of what Washington spent. The United States spent more than the next 10 largest military spenders combined, including China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Britain, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, and Ukraine. And keep in mind, many of those countries are U.S. allies. So in 2022, the U.S. spent 3 times as much on its military than China and 10 times as much on its military than Russia. That very useful graph was created by the independent researcher Stephen Semler, who has a very good Substack blog called Speaking Security. And he wrote an article about how the U.S. was responsible for around 40% of military spending in 2022. This data comes from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which published a new report showing a record high in global military spending in 2022. And Europe has largely been pushing for that increase in military spending. The report noted that total global military expenditure increased by 3.7% in 2022, reaching a new high of $2.24 trillion. And a bit over half of that is just from NATO. And over 1/3 of that is just from the United States. So 40% from the United States, over half from NATO. Total military spending on Earth was $2.24 trillion in 2022. In Europe, we saw the largest increase in 30 years, with a 13% increase in military spending in Europe. And the report noted that military expenditure by states in Central and Western Europe totaled $345 billion in 2022. That means that this is the highest military spending in real terms, that is adjusted for inflation, since 1989, which was, of course, the end of the first Cold War. So, unfortunately, I think this is a reflection of the fact that we're in a new Cold War. And just as in the first Cold War, there was an arms race and a huge amount of military spending, we're seeing something very similar today. Now, the countries in Europe that had some of the largest increases in military spending were Finland, with a 36% increase. Finland, of course, also just joined NATO. Lithuania had a 27% increase. Sweden, a 12% increase, and Poland, an 11% increase. And these are all Western allies of NATO that are working closely hand in glove with the United States and supporting Ukraine in the proxy war against Russia. Now, as much as we hear in the Western media that Russia is supposedly some great threat, in reality, Russian military spending in 2022 was $86 billion. 1/10 of the U.S. military spending of $877 billion. Ukraine's military spending in 2022 was $44 billion. That was a 640% increase, which is the highest increase that this group, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, has ever recorded in its data. I want to repeat that for emphasis. Ukraine's military spending increased by 640% in 2022, which is the largest ever increase calculated by this group that analyzes military data. And that's not mentioning the tens of billions of dollars more in Western military support for Ukraine. Now, again, the United States spent 40% roughly, that is 39%, nearly 40% of global military spending, $877 billion in 2022, which is 3 times more than what was spent by China, which is the world's second largest spender. And the US sent around $20 billion in military aid to Ukraine. That's a very conservative estimate. I've seen estimates that are triple that, but tens of billions of dollars. And the report notes that this is the largest amount of military aid given by any country to a single beneficiary in any year since the Cold War. So again, this is the new Cold War, the largest amount of military aid given to a single country since the end of the First Cold War. China's military spending, 1/3 of the US, was $292 billion. And Japan is also remilitarizing. Its military spending increased by 6%, reaching $46 billion. And again, according to this report, NATO's combined military spending was $1.23 trillion. And that's about a 1% increase since 2021, so year on year. And that's a bit over half of the entire global military expenditure. Business Insider published an article that really shows Washington's priorities. It's titled, "The U.S. spent $877 billion on the military in 2022, more than 10 times federal education spending." And if you go on the article, it notes that the federal government allocated just $76.4 billion in discretionary spending for education in 2022. So military spending is more than 10 times federal spending on education. And in 2024, it's not much better. The Biden administration has requested only $90 billion for education compared to $842 billion for the military. So, I mean, this shows a country's priorities. What can be more important than education? We're talking about the future of your country. We're talking about educating the generation of youth who are going to be the people who run your country in the future. And spending 1/10 of what you spend on the military on education reflects the fact that for the United States, war is above all everything else. It is the most important thing. It is the government's most important priority, significantly more than education, yet alone healthcare, yet alone social programs and social support. And by the way, this data that I've been looking at is only the official federal government spending data. The reality is that the Pentagon, the US Department of Defense, spends trillions of dollars that are unaccounted for. We don't know how much the US military actually spends. Yahoo Finance reported, citing Bloomberg, that the Department of Defense made $35 trillion in accounting adjustments just in 2019. In 2018, the Pentagon made $30.7 trillion in accounting adjustments. That is larger than the entire US economy, the entire GDP. And it shows that the Pentagon is unable to actually report on its spending. The Pentagon has failed every single audit that it has ever tried. Just in 2018, there were 562,000 adjustments made in the Pentagon's accounting. And a member of Congress, Jackie Speer, asked the U.S. Government Accountability Office to look into this issue, into the, quote, combined errors, shorthand, and sloppy record keeping by DoD accountants that add up to a number nearly 1.5 times the size of the U.S. economy. And she charged that the Pentagon, quote, employs accounting adjustments like a contractor paints over mold. Their priority is making the situation look manageable, not solving the underlying problem. So everything that I've been talking about today is, again, only based on the official data. So we constantly hear in Western media that they accuse China, for instance, of downplaying how much military spending it actually carries out. Oh, China's spending way more, or Russia's spending way more. Well, the US is spending significantly more, exponentially more, because the official spending in 2022 was $877 billion, 40% of the entire world's military spending, bigger than the next 10 biggest spenders combined. And yet, in reality, we're talking about tens of trillions of dollars of spending per year that's unaccounted for in the accounting, in the books of the Pentagon. So, I mean, this report referred to it as the Pentagon's $35 trillion accounting black hole. And that's a good way to describe it. It's a black hole. But the main thing that I wanted to stress today is simply that the United States remains by far the biggest threat to peace on this planet. It doesn't even come close. There's no country that comes close to waging as many wars as the United States against Korea and Vietnam and Iraq 2 times, and Syria and Libya and Yemen and Grenada and Panama. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. The U.S. has 800 foreign military bases. No other country comes even remotely close. So just keep that in mind when you see Western media reports trying to make us all afraid of China and Russia.